Well, today we're continuing our series called Rethinking Church, and I'm joined in the studio by Pastor Scott. Scott, today we're talking about giving, so why don't we start with some real simple stats on giving? How many Christians give these days in the church?
Right. Well, that's a great question. It's really interesting to dig into how American Christians give. About 5% of American Christians tithe, which means they're giving somewhere around 10% of their income.
Right.
But what I think is really interesting is historically, giving has actually gone down. The average Christian today gives about 2.5% of their income, but during the Great Depression, obviously a much worse economic time, Christians gave 3.5% of their income.
Wow.
So when you think about that, it's pretty shocking. We have a lot more and we're giving a lot less.
Yeah.
Something else that was kind of interesting is that even though 5% of Christians tithe, if asked, about almost 20% of Christians will say they tithe. So we're not quite being honest with ourselves, or at least in the surveys. And one thing that I think was kind of very sad was almost 40% of church attendees, evangelicals, don't give any money to their local church. And so the issue of giving is a real issue for churches and Christians.
And why, before we get to the points, why do you think that is? Why do you think so many churchgoers don't actually give? You know, my parents' generation, they all, all of our aunts and uncles and grandparents, they were all givers. And so few people today are. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think one reason is because we've all seen so many terrible stories about churches and pastors that have abused the giving that's come into their church. And that's a huge problem, and that breaks God's heart.
Yep.
But then I think we just spend our money on a lot of other things, and we put ourselves in debt. And Jesus said, what you do with your money, that reveals where your heart is. And I think that's just the reality. A lot of American Christians, our heart is not really with the Lord, but it's with other things.
Yeah, with some of the people that I mentor, I challenge them on this topic quite a bit, because I think a lot of people learn how to read their Bible as a discipline and maybe learn how to pray as a discipline, but giving is also a discipline, and so few people actually do it. I always challenge them. I say, hey, you're so generous to yourself, right? We love to buy ourselves, and even our families, things. Be generous to God, and that's really what today's passage is about. We're in Malachi chapter 3. It's the last chapter of the Old Testament, and this is kind of maybe a little bit of a controversial chapter, because some churches really jump on this chapter and some churches shun it, depending on what the teaching on the tithe is. But you've got a few really good talking points to work us through. So this first one is this, a little shocking. If you aren't giving, you're robbing God, according to Malachi chapter 3. Explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is pretty shocking. But God himself says there, if you want to look it up in Malachi chapter 3, I'd encourage you to do that. Basically, God says, should people cheat God? He says, but you have cheated me. And he's speaking to Israel in the Old Testament, and the Israelites are like, God, how did we cheat you? What did we do? And he says, you've cheated me because you haven't given all the tithes and offerings due to me. And so God says that you're not living up to the covenant, to the agreement that we have. And in the Old Testament, God's people, the Israelites, were commanded to give a tithe, which is about 10%, literally means 10% of what they brought in. And now, if you were really faithful, you would end up giving more than 10% because of some other stuff that went on during the year, festivals and different sacrifices. But God says, hey, you're not doing that, Israel. And if you read the whole book of Malachi, they were doing a lot of other things that were ignoring from God's commands. But here he says, you're robbing me because you're withholding what belongs to me.
Now, Scott, I can imagine some people watching this video saying, that's really offensive to me, that you would say that I'm cheating God. Those are strong words.
Yeah, they are strong words, but they're God's words. I mean, this is God speaking. It's not me speaking. And God is serious. God says, look, I've given you everything. Everything that we have comes from God. If we give nothing back to him, then we are robbing him. And we need to wrestle with that. We shouldn't try to explain it away.
All right, but it gets worse, because your second point, Scott, is if you don't give, you may experience severe consequences. And I'll admit that when I read this talking point, I get a little bit uncomfortable when I think about some people hearing these words.
Right, and again, I get uncomfortable too. But again, these are God's words. In verse 9, Malachi 3, he says, "You are under a curse," he's talking to Israel, "for your whole nation has been cheating me." And so what he's saying here, it's not just one or two people, but the whole nation has been withholding their tithes. And so they're under a curse. And the curse was economic and political and social. Now, if you're a Christian, we're not Israel, we're not ancient Israel, but there's a principle here that we have to wrestle with, which is there are going to be negative consequences, severe consequences in our lives if we don't give, if we are not generous with what God has given us.
And I can admit I've seen this in the lives of some of my friends as we've gotten older and they've made more money in their career field. I look back on some of my friends and they've experienced a lot of sorrow, not necessarily just because of money, but I think there's a connection there that I think sometimes you can get the mentality that as I make more money, I'm chasing money and I make it about the money. The Bible never says money's bad and having money's bad, but it says the love of money is bad. And a lot of times giving and love of money or lack of giving and love of money go hand in hand.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you want to say, well, what are some of the consequences that we might have in our lives? I think materialism, which is kind of what you're talking about. Just we're going to fall more and more in love with money or in love with stuff. We're going to take something that's temporary, like money, like our stuff, and elevate it to the role of God in our lives. We are going to, as I was just thinking about, what are the consequences? I think when we don't give, when we're not generous towards God, we slow down the growth of God's kingdom because we're not funding God's work. We aren't able to help people who are in need in our own church or in our community. And so, and I even think if you have children, if you're not generous to God, if you're not generous to those in need, what does it teach your kids?
Right. They're gonna see that too.
Absolutely.
They're gonna pick up that maybe money is God. Maybe chasing money is more important than being generous toward God and being obedient to His word.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter how often their youth pastor or their Sunday school teacher or you tell them be generous, be generous. If you're not generous, they're gonna be like, oh, I get it, Dad. It's really about money. It's really about stuff.
All right, your last point, though, is good news, because here's what you say, based on Malachi 3:10, God rewards His giver. So it's not just bad news, but there's some good news in here as well.
Right. And, in Malachi 3, God is really trying to get our attention, but it's also very hopeful because in verse 10, he says, "Bring all the tithes into the storehouse so there will be enough food in my temple. If you do, says the Lord of heaven's armies, I will open the windows of heaven for you. I will pour out a blessing so great you won't have enough room to take it in. Try it. Put me to the test." And this is the only place in the Bible where God says, test him. And it has to do with our giving, which I think is so instructive here. And what God is saying is, look, if you do this, if you give sacrificially, generously, you will be rewarded.
Okay, so I'm watching this televangelist. He's got lots of hair and shiny white teeth, which makes me a little jealous. But he's telling me that if I give him $10, God's going to give me back $100. Is that what this passage is talking about?
It's not what this passage is talking about. And unfortunately, a lot of poor pastors have taught this to mean like, well, if you drive a Toyota Camry, if you give, it'll become a Mercedes or something like that. That's not what God is saying here. God is saying, though, that He will reward us in ways that we can't even imagine. Even Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, He says, give and more will be given to you. It's the image that Jesus talks about is that you give and the blessing that comes back to you overflows. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 9, and he doesn't say that if you give, you'll reap a lot of rewards financially, but he says you'll have everything you need. You'll be equipped for every good work. And so I think what God is promising here is that you'll be blessed in so many different spiritual ways in your life, in a closer relationship with Him. You'll be making an impact for what really matters in life. And it's true that God does take care of us, and God is just very generous to us. So I don't think we ever have to fear like, well, if I give, I'm not going to have enough for myself, because no, God's going to take care of us.
All right, well, that's all for now on giving, and I encourage you to rethink giving. Read through Malachi chapter 3 and check out the discussion questions below. Talk about it with a group or a mentor, and we'll see you next week for the next video.